Yes, good evening, everyone. Welcome to SJS Writes panel discussion featuring mystery, suspense, and thriller authors. I'm Shawnee Smith, founder of SJS Writes, and I am excited to introduce to you our amazing panelists who graciously answered my request to showcase their expertise and insights on the mystery, suspense, and thriller genres. And I have the pleasure to introduce our first panelist, and I will share my screen. Our first panelist is Wolf O'Rourke, special author in charge and transmedia storyteller. Wolf O'Rourke had delusions of protecting extraterrestrial life forms for Men in Black before he looked into a neuralizer without shades. Now he mines his implanted memories of centuries in cybersecurity, politics, and finance to create thrilling stories, pitting quirky characters with high-tech gadgets against evil villains with vile weapons. His Zastra series follows a Vegas casino host turned superheroine through the sordid underbelly of crime at home and abroad. Wolf's cyber thriller series explores the secret world of bits and bytes through the eyes of a pink-haired hacktress. His techno thrillers reflect the 23 places he has lived and studied the polyglot people that populate his transmedia storytelling. In real life, he frequents the Henderson Writers Group, the Romance Writers of America, Sin City Writer Group, and the Las Vegas Screenwriters Group. On the net, you'll find him at www.wolfo'rourke.com or Wolf O'Rourke at the fashionable social media channels. Thank you, Wolf.
Thank you, Shannon.
Our next panelist is Lala Corriere. Since early childhood, Lala has held a passion for all of the arts. Her fifth grade teacher, Miss Macy, was the first mentor to suggest she consider a career in writing. That extension of the arts, the written word, turned into a full-time career and discipline. Some of her career highlights include endorsement and long-term mentorship by the late Sidney Sheldon, USA Today's must-read Suspense, an award-winning poetry and magazine article writer. Readers and reviewers applaud Corriere's hallmark original plots, in-depth character portrayals, rich settings, and authentic dialogue, all delivered with a fresh voice and plenty of plot twists. With gusto, she now includes the genre of magical realism and the introduction to the traveling cane alongside her suspense and thrillers. Lala is a desert rat. She nestles there with her husband of over 30 years, next to Finnegan, Phoebe, and Fernando, their teacup Yorkies. Thank you, Lala. Last but not least, our third panelist is John French. John L. French is a retired crime scene supervisor who worked 40 plus years with the Baltimore Police Department Crime Laboratory. As a break from the realities of his job, he began writing science fiction, pulp, horror, fantasy, and of course, crime fiction. His most recent books include Mortal Sins, When the Moon Shines, Cheesy at Bay, and with Patrick Thomas, Frankenstein, Monsters of the Abyss. He can be contacted at jfrenchfam @aol.com. Thank you, John. You. And now we can begin with the panel discussion questions. And I will share my screen. And the first question is, who or what inspired you to become a writer? And the second part of the question is, who or what influenced you to write mystery, suspense, and or thriller? And we'll start the discussion with John.
Okay, my first real introduction to the mystery genre was in high school. Our first book of readers our first book of stories contained stories like The Infallible Godal and of course Arthur Conan Doyle, along with some mysteries, along with science fiction and fantasy. And we were encouraged to read not only the books we had to, but the books, but to read on our own. And I started with Ray Bradbury, who, in addition to being a science fiction writer, was also a mystery writer, and of course, an Agatha Christie. By college, I'd graduated to Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and things like that. I think all mystery fans are convinced that they have a mystery story in them. But it wasn't until I had been working in the crime lab as a crime scene investigator for some years until I came up with an idea for what I thought was the perfect ending to a mystery story. And then having the perfect ending, I had to write a story around it. And I submitted it to some small press magazines, and to my surprise, it was accepted. And not only was it accepted, it was named as one of the best hard-boiled short stories of that year. I'd tell you what year, but that would date me. So I kept writing, and I started making friends in the writing world. There was one gentleman, he's passed now. It's almost like 7 years since he died, C.J. Henderson, who really encouraged me to continue with writing, to the point that he would get me sucked into various anthologies regardless of the genre. And it turned out, whether it was science fiction, fantasy, horror, all my stories had a crime, had a crime in them to be solved. And so that's how I got into writing mysteries, and I have been writing for about 30 years now, and with several books. And despite the fact that I've written horror and urban fantasy and things like that, crime writing is still my main passion. I think it might have to do with working 30, I was, worked the streets in Baltimore for well over 30 years, working with detectives and working on crime scenes and seeing seeing what really happens and what is, and what it's really like.
Thank you. Yeah, you really emphasize the importance of personal experience as well as mentorship, how it molded your writing. This is similar to Lala also. Lala, what are your thoughts?
Honestly, not necessarily in this order, but again, it was my 5th grade teacher that one of my favorite classes starting at 5th grade was my creative writing classes. And Miss Macy pulled me aside and told me I should really consider a career in writing. I did not followed that advice and did many other different things, but always, in fact, I kept her note in a little lock box under my, hidden in my closet. But and then there was my mom, who I learned by watching her, and she was a stay-at-home mom, but every day she carved out time in the afternoon to lay down and read a book. And she would read Agatha Christie. And then she went to Mary Higgins Clark, and then Sidney Sheldon. That would go on as I began my writing career for me to push forward. And I contacted Sidney Sheldon. Now, I wasn't published before Sidney Sheldon passed away, but he became my mentor. And my mom was still alive when she saw the communications going on between Sheldon and myself. And that meant the world for me, for Mom to see that I was communicating with such a great writer. So those were my inspirations for sure.
That's fantastic, just to have a well-known author just reach back out to you.
Yeah, you know, I reached out to several, and many of them said, "Oh, I'm not allowed to talk to you. You're unpublished," and blah 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 blah. But he did. Very meaningful.
It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Wolf, what are your thoughts?
Keep in mind, my memory is somewhat fuzzy, given my unfortunate incident with the Men in Black. So I had to reconstruct everything from evidence, and there are copies of a newsletter I put out in 5th grade. So I've been making stories and writing for a very, very long time, maybe a century perhaps. And then, of course, there's other evidence like student newspapers and local papers that I've written for. So writing has always been essentially part of my life since essentially I could spell, I guess. Before that, it would have been clay tablets or Play-Doh. And like many people, I have attention deficit disorder. And if you can't pay attention to anything, you gravitate to the things that really grab you, where there's always something happening. So naturally, I started gravitating towards thrillers, which are probably the fastest paced genre in general. And of course, a lot of that are things like James Bond, which really impressed me. Yeah.
That's interesting that you use some of your scholastic experience and then to just channel that into your writing, as far as like where you say you had attention deficit, you were able to find an outlet with thriller where you said that scenes change here and there, so you would never get bored with it. Thank you, Wolf. All right, now I will display our second question. Reading and writing mystery suspense books improves analytical thinking, helps you face your fears, and allows you to assess your moral compass. How has reading and writing mystery suspense and/or thriller enhanced your life? We'll start with Lala.
Well, that's a bad choice because I'm not sure where you are with my little notes. Enhanced your life. Well, I know exactly where you are. Thank you very much. And I want to start with saying this is one of the most intellectual and thought-provoking questions I have ever received. That's what I want to say. But to answer it, as I love writing suspense, mysteries, thrillers, I personally have led a very sheltered life. I personally suffered one burglary. I mean, I've lived a sheltered life, so I've had to dig down deep. I've had to meet with people. I've had to reach down into the emotions. I've had to really reach to feel what the pain is and what it is like there in terms of not only the victims, but the perpetrators. And so I've just had to sit back and really imagine, because I personally have been fortunate and not really felt any of this. And so it's been a big journey for me, and one I'm very, wouldn't say I'm happy to have traveled, but I'm honored to have traveled. And it has enhanced my life for sure. It's expanded my life. I've talked to many people that I normally, for example, this is kind of off the line of a mystery or anything, but one of my subplots dealt with transgenders. I've never met a transgender before. I lived a sheltered life. Boy, I have so many friends that are transgenders now. I have a gal in the UK. Her name is Poppycox. I never had a friend named Poppycox before, but she's my dear friend now. And so again, it's reaching out to worlds I never imagined, and I'm very grateful for that. So yeah, it's changed my life, changed my world, expanded my world.
And yeah, it's interesting because I know a lot of times I've read that authors have to do a lot of research if they're not familiar with the subject, or for you to actually get to know.
Dig out there and get to know them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
question.
Thank you. John, what are your thoughts?
How has it enhanced my life? By just from the time I started writing, I have been meeting so many different people, a lot of whom became my friends. I mentioned C.J. Henderson. I actually I knew him before I became a writer, and we became, from working together on stories, working together on the tables at conventions, we became very good friends. And a lot of my friends I've met through, through the writing, through going to conventions, working dealers' rooms, and that is the sheer fun for me of the writing. It certainly isn't the money. To me, royalties are those people in England who live in castles. But it's meeting people, meeting fellow writers, exchanging ideas, and meeting the people who come up to the table at conventions, at shows. Shani, that's how you and I met. Mm-hmm. I had a table at a local craft show, and I apologized to him for me. I forgot his name, but he came over. He liked what I was writing, and he said he probably told you, and you said something like, you got to go meet this guy, and so it's the community, it's the camaraderie of the writing world. But there's something else in there about moral compass. And one thing writing gives you a chance to do is play with people whose moral compasses point in different directions. Good guys and bad guys, and those people who work the gray area between the white and the black, and it gives you a chance to explore being the bad guy, explore being the person who lives in the shadows. The dark, the shadow is the darkness that is cast by the light. So it gives you a chance to do that, and in doing so, you might be able to you might either deliberately or unconsciously help somebody. I have a book. It's called The Devil of Harbor City. And it's about one brave cop in a pre-Miranda world who's out to clean up a corrupt town any way he can. And his catchphrase is, "Are you ready to pay for your sins?" And that's what, if, you know, a lot of times if you buy a book, like if you buy The Devil of Harbor City from me, it'll be like, "Shaney, are you ready to pay, always pay for your sins?" And then my signature. Well, I did this at a convention, and about 20 minutes later, the woman who bought it said, "I just read what you wrote. I have to tell you something. I recently stole a lot of money from my sister, and now I know I have to pay it back."
Mm.
You know, so it's one of these days, one of your books just might change somebody's life, and that's worth the writing.
You bet.
Fantastic insight, especially the part where you mentioned it's really not all about the money, it's about the impact.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Wolf, what are your thoughts?
I almost view it like a chicken and egg situation, that mysteries teach you something, but probably the people that are interested in that something also gravitate towards mysteries. It's probably the genre that teaches you the most how to think through a problem, because a problem is at the heart of the mystery genre. And so people gravitate towards that like solving problems and like thinking them through and try to being ahead of the author. So for one thing, then you have to be very good in planning, which kind of suited me, because back in ancient Egypt, I was one of the project managers, and you really had to get good at planning, because not only did the pharaohs tend to be a bit capricious, because papyrus was mostly reserved for taxes, we had to chisel our project plans, which meant the plans were literally set in stone. So you couldn't really make mistakes. You had to do every step right and consequently follow it to the end. And that's how thrillers really are built, good thrillers, that the whole thing makes logical sense and goes all the way to the end. Yet at the same time, you don't want the reader to get ahead of you. So you also learn how to be unpredictable and throw in red herrings and twists and things that really throw people off track. And so, and also, of course, you have to get really creative with a lot of aspects. I mean, people have seen probably just about every way to break into some place or assassinate somebody. So coming up with creative ways to do these things that people don't expect and take them by surprise really challenges your creativity. So it helps you get up to a better level.
Definitely, I think that you made an important point by people say thinking outside the box, but you just described thinking and writing outside of the box in order to engage your audience. So that's outstanding. Thank you. We will move on to the third question. Mystery, suspense, and thriller are all genres that are lumped together or confused because of their similar characteristics. How do you, as an author, differentiate between them? And we will start with Wolf.
This is kind of an interesting question, especially nowadays. We have to keep in mind that with the paper book, these genres were mostly there for the publishers and the stores. If you have to physically shelf a book, it's gotta be in one genre. And then as the genres exploded, of course, you had to start ever narrowing it down ever more so people know where to go look. This whole issue has kind of gone away. with the online selling. And Amazon allows you 30 categories per book. And so you really don't have to do this anymore. And in fact, you look at the big classics, they tend to have these multiple genres. Incidentally, it's the 25th anniversary of Harry Potter. So big surprise, Harry Potter is back on the YA thriller charts. Now, you can argue about that. There are thriller elements in it, of course, and the overall series definitely has an epic sweep and kind of international setting like many big thrillers have. But most people would consider Harry Potter fantasy. But it's like it's the same with Twilight and other series, Hunger Games. Hunger Games, the first book is probably not a thriller technically. It's very contained. It's more adventure and fantasy. But by the end, when they go to war against each other and the stake is the survival of the entire human population, so to speak, you could say that is a thriller. So the distinctions are probably less meaningful nowadays. But if you wanted to be just really superficial, mysteries tend to focus on a single mystery. It's usually a professional that tries to solve it. And so you follow a detective or amateur sleuths like Miss Marple. Thrillers tend to be on the other end. The biggest thrillers, the protagonists are often thrust into the story, often very unwillingly, and that is part of the distinction, is that thrillers tend to be defined by the villain, because it's the villain pushing the story and the protagonist. And I have found that suspense has pretty much disappeared as a separate category because it is so ill-defined. If you look at the theories for writing a good thriller, it has to have mystery, it has to have suspense, and it has to have thrills. So you need all three in a good story, regardless of the categories. And so the whole thing starts shifting around. It, like, again, Hunger Games. Is it a thriller? Is it a mystery? Is it suspense? I mean, it has all those elements. It's also fantasy. It's also action adventure. So if you want to, you can still narrow it down, but in the end, at this point, the distinction is almost meaningless.
Thank you, Wolf, for that analytical breakdown of the genres, because I know a few writers that are starting out, they may be trying to figure out, okay, what should I focus on? But you just explained it beautifully, how now with technology, all these genres have kind of merged, and you don't have to really limit yourself. John, what are your thoughts?
Okay, this is not original with me, but the best distinction I've heard between mystery and thriller and suspense involves a bomb. In mystery, the bomb has already gone off, and the investigators have to figure out who planted the bomb, where are they, do they have another bomb? But it's basically a whodunit. Or even if you know who did it, the investigators still have to find him. And like in Columbo, half the fun is how do they find him? How do they solve the crime? In a thriller, there's a bomb. It hasn't gone off yet. But the protagonist have to find the bomb. So the difference between mystery and thriller is that in a mystery, something has already happened, and the investigators have to figure out why and who. In a thriller, it's something is going to happen, and they have to find out who might be doing it and try to stop them. The suspense comes with the bomb, with James Bond in the room. The bomb is ticking off, and the suspense comes. Well, of course, it's Bond, so you know what's going to happen. But the suspense comes with: is he going to be able to disarm the bomb before it goes off? Now, if you've got James Bond, you can unless you're reading the Ian Fleming books, you pretty much know he's going to save the day. But if it's an unknown protagonist, like the Hunt for Red October, the suspense, the thriller was: are they going to successfully, is the Red October going to successfully manage to defect? But the suspense on everything is, oh my God, is it going to go off? And I think suspense works best in a short story, but I think one of the most suspenseful movies I've seen is the John Travolta version of The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, because that basically kept everybody in a state of anticipation throughout the whole movie. Even toward the end, you really were waiting for something to happen, and you did not know what was going to happen. So that's my take on the three genres. Not that, but Wolf said thrillers have elements of mysteries. Mysteries have elements of thrillers. And a good thriller, a good mystery has some suspense in it. I mean, when Hercule Poirot or Nick Charles stands before that room full of people and says, "One of you is a murderer," and then everybody just, who done it?
Thank you so much, John, for providing the practical examples to describe those genres. Lala, what are your thoughts?
Well, I do believe that Wolf and John did a great job in summarizing. I think the only thing I would add is that for an indie writer, yeah, it's a big quagmire. But again, Amazon has lifted that up, so you can just put them on any genre that you want to, unlimited practically. If you're dealing with an editor and a publisher, they're going to have their own rules, and they're going to say, this is suspense, this is thriller. They're going to push you into a category. I know that very recently, I gave my manuscript, my arc, to a well-known writer, and for a blurb, and she came back to me and with a blurb that I totally appreciated, and she said something about this great thriller, and I'm like, I wrote a thriller? I mean, I'm like, oh, did I really? Yeah, I changed my categories really fast because, yeah, it's a conundrum really out there. But basically, Wolf said it correctly. It's a little bit of it. Well, John did too. It's a little bit of everything. So it's totally undefined. It's a mystery.
Thank you, Lala, for explaining what you have to do as if you work up under a publishing house versus if you're...
Yeah, they'll have their own ways for sure. Mm-hmm.
And Shani, of course, if you want to elevate the story, you also go for other elements that have deeper social meaning, like Cyberspiracy is a coming-of-age story. It's also about bullying. And I know from my Amazon data that I get sales out of those categories. Mm-hmm. So it's not... A good story has so many different layers that, especially when you're dealing with YA, where the categories often double up with the adult categories, where you can have 20, 30 categories. And you shouldn't limit yourself by these really hard rules. A good story is a good story. And if you have the spine right, that can be your major category, but there's nothing wrong with adding all these other elements. And of course, we know that particularly from the movie world, where this is more structured, that good movies always have at least an A and a B story. And if the A story isn't a romance, the B story is going to be. So success, big works tend to have a romance element in them, regardless of the primary genre. So don't worry too much about genre. Make it a good story.
Thank you. That is sound advice. All right, we'll move on to the fourth question. All right, true crime and mystery thriller podcasts have become a popular way to consume mystery and suspense fictional works. How do you think that the podcast will affect the mystery, suspense, thriller genres as it relates to the more traditional way of distributing fictional works, such as the paperback, ebook, and audiobook? So we will start with John.
Okay. I'll be honest. I don't really listen to podcasts. I still go with, I still go with print books, and I never really thought that many years ago, I never thought that ebooks would be considered traditional publishing, but I guess it is now. But I have noticed that a lot of podcasts focus less on fiction and more on real and true crime. There's been a couple of notable, I won't mention their names, but there have been a couple of notable podcasts coming out of Baltimore involving questionable, or at least in some people's minds, still unsolved murders. And these generate interest in crime. And it's a small step from listening to podcast to wanting to know more about it. To take, for instance, an unfortunate incident, a very unfortunate incident that happened with the Baltimore City Police Department, the Gun Trace Task Force. It was on the news, it was on internet, I'm sure there were podcasts about it, but now people are starting to read about it. There are 2 books out there. There's an HBO series about it, and I'm just guessing now, but I'm sure that interest in this is going to lead back to a similar incident that took place in Los Angeles quite a few years ago. I think it was called the Ramparts. There were other police scandals in New York City and over the place. So what I'm thinking is that podcasts, people start listening to the podcast and then they want more. They get interested in crime. And then it's a small step from true crime because they want more, so they travel to fictional crime. It's just, what's the expression? A rising tide lifts all boats. So if people get interested in crime, then it helps all the authors. That's about it. That's my thoughts on that.
Thank you for sharing, especially the part where you relate the true crime trickling over to fiction. So these authors in this genre won't really feel discouraged, like, oh my gosh, podcasts are taking over. It can be a way to enhance. Lala, what are your thoughts?
I am totally embarrassed because I pretty much must abstain. I have hid my head in the sand. I just, I have a YouTube channel that I've ignored. Whatever's up there, I need to take down. And I really want to, it's on my desk here. You could see my desk. I really want to get involved with that. I did, on a similar note, I checked out Amazon's Vela program, and I researched it with lots of author friends, and they are all going, you know, it's just not pulling it out. I found one author that said she's selling that way. Is everybody familiar with Vela? Vela is where you'll sell a chapter depending on
Yeah.
chapter per unit and sell it, and then you'll put up another one and sell it, and like $1, $3, I don't know, but it's not, best as I can tell, with a large pool of writers, it's not doing so well. So
I mean, I've heard about it, but it seems to me that short stories might be a better way of going, because you're giving for each episode, if you will, you're giving them a complete story rather than making them wait a week or something to find out, what the man with the gun who walked into the room is going to do.
Yeah, maybe.
And he's not standing there a whole week waiting to see.
Well, I'm grateful. You're making me reassess my what I need to do. So I just haven't done it. All I got.
Thank you for your insight. Wolf, what are your thoughts?
This may be heresy to talk about this among writers, but I have an excuse. I also write movie scripts. I write comic strips. So to me, the form is less important. It's a story. And every one of the forms has necessities and restrictions that go along with writing it. A movie script is structured quite differently from a book, but it's still the same story. And as long as you know what is required for the form, you can tell a good story in the medium. So to me, the podcast is just another form of storytelling. And it's not even that new or original. I mean, many thrillers, many mysteries before television were done as radio broadcasts. The podcast is just a newer form of that in a digital medium. And let's not forget where storytelling really started. It didn't start in paper form. Again, the papyrus was expensive. It was limited to scribes that collected taxes. And parchment was even more expensive, which is why so few books were produced in Europe until the Arabs introduced paper. The Odyssey, possibly one of the earliest thrillers, certainly action adventure, was related by bards, possibly on a harp, and telling the story. Same for the Ramayana, same for Beowulf, same for King Arthur. King Arthur wasn't written down until the 13th century. I mean, there were fragments, but it was Geoffrey von Monmouth that really collected all that into something called a book. Before that, it was just told. So the podcast is just another way of telling a story. And incidentally, we do know from the publishing world that there is little overlap between buyers of paperbacks and ebooks and audiobooks. There isn't even that much overlap between buyers of paperbacks and ebooks. People have their preferences, and the more forms you make available, the more people you can reach.
Mm-hmm.
It's true. Excellent feedback. Just really emphasizing that the story is important, no matter what form. Just make sure you have an outstanding story. All right. And we'll go with our fifth question. Mystery, suspense, and thriller genres have misconceptions that include the only reason to read is to figure out who did what. Readers are only looking to escape from reality. Men are usually the protagonists in the storyline. How do you dispel these misconceptions in your writing? We'll start with Lala.
Well, first of all, we've already defined mysteries are basically whodunits, and we certainly have a lot of readers out there that want to be the sleuths. They cover up with a blanket and pretend they're sleuths, the amateur sleuths, and that's just the nature of definitely those who read cozy mysteries and miseries. Especially today, in today's crazy world, we all like to escape. And whether that is reading a cozy mystery or reading, I don't know, Conroy, or, any of the classics or anything, we want to escape the world that we're into. And so whether it's Westerns or historicals, or escaping to find our mental health somewhere else. And sometimes we escape what we think is our terrible world to an even more violent world so that we can say we don't have it so bad. I think, I've heard from some of my readers that, wow, that sounds pretty good to me. So I think that's all important, and for our mental health. And, so escape is good. Escape is good today. I don't think that we write, at least in today's world, men as protagonists. I think mostly in years past, they've been our antagonists. And right now, I think, at least with my writing and the books that I read, it's really split. I mean, there are bad chicks out there and there are bad men out there. And so I think it's quite equal from what I'm reading and what I'm writing. So I don't really think that there is a division there from, and again, throw out the red herrings, because y'all think it's the sweet little blonde, and it turns out to be what looks all the time to be the bad man. But we didn't go for him because we were thinking it was that sweet little blonde. So throw in the red herrings, and I don't know. I don't think there are rules anymore. The red herrings are fun. So make everybody think it's somebody else and twist it around. So that's my personal. I like to throw in some twists.
Thank you, Lala. Wolf, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there is among some people kind of a Puritan ethic that isn't necessarily helpful. I mean, we have to consider how human beings are for most parts. And this is an interesting fact. The neurotransmitter most responsible for us feeling good, for us being happy, dopamine, is also the key neurotransmitter for forming memories. And this makes perfect sense if you consider any animal for that matter, a dog or a cat. How do they learn what they're supposed to do? How do they learn? For example, how does a cat learn that grooming itself is important? Well, the licking of the fur makes the cat feel good, and the cat remembers that. The same thing works for math, the same thing works for science. The most successful teaching system in the world has been exported to over 100 countries, has been around for 60 years, and was from the start built by experts in pedagogy and didactic and so on, is called Sesame Street. You know, I mean, I did a project in China once where I had to learn the Chinese numbers because you couldn't go, most Chinese back then didn't speak English. You couldn't go to market and buy anything or pay if you didn't know the numbers. I'd be hard pressed to give you 5 numbers at this point. I can't even remember what one is. But to this day, I can count in Spanish because being from LA, I would wake up to Plaza Sesamo with their count song in Spanish, and it works. It's got music, it's got things happening. It works for most learning types. So packaging important things into entertainment is not a bad thing. And let's not forget what the best-selling book in the world is. It's a collection of stories. It's not a collection of 150 commandments. The Bible is a collection of stories that teach you something that you can remember well. So there's nothing wrong with escapism and entertainment. We need it. That's how we learn. And that also addresses kind of the last point. The reality is we know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. And it's the same, writers tend to write what they know. When I start a story, the main protagonist of the cyber thriller series was a man, because that's what I'm used to. Most of the roles were men. But it's kind of, especially in the hacker world, every male cliche has been done down to the male hacker, the blind male hacker using a teletype. Very few women characters have been done because, and I think it's partly a gateway function. It used to be the publishing industry was dominated by men. The movie industry is still dominated by men. So it was mostly men that wrote stories, and they wrote themselves. They wrote their friends. I started thinking, we have cliches among women too. The goth, I mean, it's really bad actually among cyber thrillers that they tend to be outsiders. That there's almost no stories that involve feminine women. So I went in exactly that direction. I thought, what would be the most interesting character to write to fight against a professional Navy SEAL who can basically make mincemeat out of her with his pinky? If I could have made Cowabunga a 9-year-old, I would have, but it doesn't work with the story. So she's 16 years old. She's scared. She hides in her room, and she's thrust into this international thriller all of a sudden. That makes for a far more interesting story. And then I systematically worked on all the other characters until now Cyberspiracy has gender parity among speaking roles. Because there's no reason why the police officer cannot be a woman. There isn't. And that they are that in real life. Just look at CSI as an example, for example. So I think that this is breaking down as the gatekeepers are getting more diversified. And in fact, when I checked the YA thriller bestseller charts for this show, with J.K. Rowling now being back on the charts with Harry Potter, the top 10 that day, there was not a man among them. Now, this is also more true of YA. YA tends to be more female-dominated. Sarah Shepard, J.K. Rowling, Susan Collins. So this is breaking down, but there's per se no reason for it other than the biases that used to exist. And thanks again to self-publishing, a lot of them are going away.
It's true. Thank you, Wolf, for being an instrument in breaking down and dispelling the stereotypes. John, what are your thoughts?
Okay, mysteries. People read mysteries because they want to know who done it, or how did they do it, or how they were caught. And really, that's what a mystery is. If you end a mystery without giving people resolution, you haven't done your job. Mystery to me is where rules have been broken, and and you have to find out who broke the rules, why they broke the rules, and come to some sort of resolution that puts things maybe not back into the same order, but into some kind of an order. As far as protagonists, I think nowadays we write what we're most familiar with. Except for one book series, all my main characters are male. The exception is the Bianca Jones series. She's a Baltimore City police detective who fights monsters. There's 5 books in the series right now. A sixth and last one is coming out hopefully by August. But but the thing is, just because your main character is male doesn't mean you can't surround him by strong women who, at least if they're not the antagonist, they challenge your hero to do better. They will in some respect change. They should in some respect change the hero's life. And we've been hacked. Yeah. So anyway, and getting to I'm sorry, what was the last part of the question? I tend to ramble.
Just how do you dispel these misconceptions in your writing?
Be honest, I try not to. People read I think people read my kind of fiction as an escape from reality. I write it as an escape from reality. I spent 40 plus years in the Baltimore City Police Crime Lab. The one book that I've put out that is most like my job is the more current one, Mortal Sins, which reflects what has been going on in Baltimore City and in the country for the last 5 or 6 years. But that being said, I think people read, I write, but I don't generally write about my job. If I wanted to write about my job, I'd write nonfiction. I wouldn't write people fighting monsters. I wouldn't write locked room, airlocked mysteries. I wouldn't write about a fairy SWAT team. I wouldn't write about 2 monsters in Prohibition era Frederick County, Maryland, who are being used by competing roadhouses as weapons against each other. I wouldn't write about Chessie, the Chesapeake Bay sea monster. It's all, for me, it's all escapist fiction, hoping to take people away from the real world for just a little while and let them enjoy my world.
Thank you, John, for your insights on this.
Thank you.
Definitely not really wanting to dispel, just really want to be your authentic self. And I think that many people can relate to that. All right, now we're at our last question. What current or upcoming projects / events would you like to share with the audience? And we will start with Wolf.
Hey, I'm working on the sequel to Cyberspiracy called Cyber Furry, which of course continues our heroine's journey. And she will have her first boyfriend in there and her first real heartbreak. And it's a different, expansive story. It's not quite. These tend to be more serial. It's not like a Harry Potter where there's a big overarching plot behind it. These are more episodic. So there's a new story that she has to deal with a more international scope, and that's what's coming out right now.
We seem to have lost Lala, and we have an interloper.
Oh, I know who that is.
Okay.
Yeah. But we did lose Lala. Let's see, hopefully she was able to come back. John, what are your upcoming projects?
Okay. Current books that are out now are the aforementioned Frankenstein, Monsters of the Abyss, which is written with Patrick Tomich, which is a retelling of the Frankenstein story. Pat and I put in all the things that Mary Shelley could not or would not put in. It has been called my very first romance novel because, yes, there is romance. And the big question in the Frankenstein Monsters of the Abyss is, what makes a monster? Do we have a choice of become monster? And exactly how many monsters were there in Frankenstein? Also, Mortal Sins, which is a collection of stories about a forensic investigator who works at the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office. As I mentioned, it reflects what's going on in the city and the nation with stories that are, as they say on television, ripped from the headlines. Coming up, I have a collection of stories set in a fictional city called Harbor City, and it's called Wages of Sin. Jericho Sin being a kind of an investigator for hire along in the lines of the old Have Gun Will Travel TV show. You know, he is a troubleshooter for people in trouble. And Bianca Jones, The Last Monster, which is the final collection in the Bianca Jones series. And just out is Zorro's Exploits, a collection of news stories about Zorro. It's a follow-up to Zorro's The Daring Escapades. And I have a story in each of those books. So yes, I got the right Zorro.
Sounds exciting. All the different projects you have coming out. I know the readers will be satisfied with projects. I'm so sorry we lost Lala when she's able to come back on. But I thank you all for joining. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. And I hope you've learned some things about each other and writing styles that will encourage you to continue on.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting us.
Thank you so much. And I hope you have a wonderful holiday weekend.
You too.
Thank you.